I'm here with David Collard and Kurt Luchs about their two recent books, Tributaries or Tributaries, depending on where you live, by Kurt, essays and verses flowing from and celebrating favorite poems. This is a book with 20 poems by 20 poets, essays by Kurt, and tribute poems written in reaction to them. So, fabulous book. This is coming out in December. And David Collard's A Crumpled Swan, 50 essays about Abigail Parry's In the Dream of the Cold Restaurant. And there are 50 essays widely ranging, discussing the poem and poetry and the world that abuts it. So I thought they should talk. So here they are.
Hello, David. You know, I recall, I believe the first time we spoke was when you were kind enough to have an online meeting celebrating the first issue of Exacting Clam.
Indeed.
And I was one of the people that you interviewed me, and I had the very first of these tributaries. In there, it was an essay and a poem responding to the Wallace Stevens poem of Mere Being. And I just recall that being a very fun experience, and that's what got me interested in following your weekly circus of literary stuff that ran for so long and really was a bright spot in the middle of the pandemic and everything else.
The happy days of the COVID pandemic. Yes, and I remember that very well. And happily, your approach, which I think is a brilliant idea, to take one poem, to subject it to a very close, granular reading, and then to produce a poem of your own which either aligns with it, or reacts to it, or is an homage or pastiche, is such a productive seam. And you've done quite a lot of these now in Exacting Clam, the quarterly transatlantic journal published by Sagging Meniscus. But these are now gathered together, or some of them at least, are together in...
That's all of them. In fact, the book actually includes two that haven't run yet. Number 19 and number 20. I think 19 will come out next month, and 20 will come out in February in time for spring.
That would be the last one is James Tate, isn't it?
He's the last one, and I think Charles Simic is right before him.
So this is an anthology of all published to date and more. And will there be more after that?
If my publisher will let me, I'm kind of hooked on the idea. I'm enjoying it so much, and there's so many that I haven't put into the book, and so many things that are lacking. And I've got at least 40 other poems and poets I'd like to write about, and I have to winnow that down.
I hope you will. I suppose the only restriction is the cost of licensing certain poems by certain poets, whether living or recently dead. That must be a constraint that you have to work within.
Some were rather, the range, correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob, who's listening, but I think the most expensive one was $600 some, and the cheapest one was $25. There were 3 that are in the public domain, and actually all of the authors are dead. That's one of the requirements for me doing it, because I felt they had to be in the Dead Poets Society to bring a perspective on their whole body of work to whatever the poem we're discussing is.
Well, you have a generous range dating back to Homer, so very dead. Mostly, it has to be said, 20th century American poets. If I can drag things over to my side of the pond for a moment, the only British poets, I think, are Philip Larkin, D.H. Lawrence, and Lewis Carroll. Have I missed anyone?
I think that's right. I mean, I think I'd like to get more Brits into the next one. No need to get that
to your Dante. I mean, I'm very interested in the difference between an American canon, because there are poets here I simply haven't heard of who are canonical and much loved by you and no doubt by many American readers, but who haven't really crossed the pond.
I've been noticing that's one of the notes I have here about we're two people separated by a common language, and unfortunately it applies too much to poetry. When I looked at your acknowledgments section at the end of your book, I realized that I did not know the names or works of most of the poets, and I felt, and Abigail Parry I was introduced to by your book, and very happily, and I've now ordered her 2 books, and I'm looking forward to getting them.
Well, it's fair to say that Abigail Parry is not a household name, but then no poets are anymore. It seems to me.
That's
even the
true.
most distinguished and public of
That's-
poets. Over here, the
that-
laureate. Most people couldn't tell you who the poet laureate is in this country.
Yeah, I forget who it
Maybe you
was.
couldn't either.
I knew
It's a
when it
pretty
was
good
Ted
poet.
Hughes.
Well, yes, times have moved on. Simon Armitage is the current and very
Right.
distinguished poet laureate.
Right.
He's not bad at all.
So I
Ted
think I
Hughes,
can-
you claim, is the best. You claimed Ted Hughes and Philip Larkin are the two best poets writing in English since W.B. Yeats. What a load of cobblers!
You countered that with W.H. Auden, and I didn't really have a counter to that because Auden is obviously very great, and I think you mentioned a few others too.
Well, my default setting is Auden, but if you want a poet who straddles America and Britain equally, in America he's an American poet.
Very interesting fellow. I'd love to do something on him. I don't know if I'm quite adequate to the task, but obviously I admire him hugely. But in my opinion,
But Hughes and Larkin for you are the...
I think in their own very different way, they're completely different poets, but I love them both.
Oh, absolutely.
There's another guy. There's a Scotsman, Robin Robertson. I like quite a bit.
Not much in their league, I don't think. In the sense that Larkin and to an extent Hughes write poetry that you can't simply remember, but you cannot forget. There are lines
Yes.
of Larkin you want to shake off, but you can't on Resting Death
Yes.
one whole day now.
True enough.
And that poetry for me, it's stuff that you can't forget even if you want to. And Robin Robinson, bless him, I don't think has come up with many lines or poems that one unwittingly can remember.
Let's see what happens. Sometimes they have a way of surprising. Yeats was doing his best work on his deathbed and was determined. I mean, I think he took his last breath thinking of a poem. I'm sure he must have. And that's something for other writers to admire and try to emulate.
And of course, it's not a hissing contest, if I can call it that. It's not who's the greatest, who's the best, who's the most significant poet, who's the most substantial. It's the one you're reading at the time that matters.
Right,
and
right.
what they say to you and what they share with you about what it means to be alive.
Many of the poets that are in the book are ones that influenced me when I was growing up. As you say, mostly Americans, mostly from a generation just previous to mine, or maybe a couple previous to mine. And I was looking to them as I was trying to write, which I did from the age of 16 to 21 when I switched to humor and comedy for many years.
And very successfully, if I may say so. Here's the thing. Is it because on different sides of the Atlantic, there are different methods of distribution? Poetry tends to come into the world through small magazines and similar publications, and they don't necessarily cross the Atlantic. I don't suppose you can buy or could buy many of the key English magazines of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, such as the New Review.
Only online if you were aware of them, because they're given credit in the acknowledgement section of a UK writers, and which is how I used to, in my younger days, find out which magazines to submit to. I'd take my favorite poets and say, well, they printed your stuff, maybe they'll like mine. In a few cases, they did.
The internet has now replaced the economy of little magazines and the places in which poetry was formerly trialed and where one could expect to be read by a sympathetic audience. That's changed completely. And the reach, of course, is far greater. One can appear simultaneously all over the world on the internet, whereas the slow percolation of poetry through the Criterion or the Little Review or magazine, that's no longer a case, is it? But as I say, so many of the poets in here were completely unknown to me. I'm sorry to say, but I'm vastly ignorant, because there's so much poetry, isn't there? And of course,
there is.
And there's Canadian poetry and Australian poetry, and one can't keep up. One can't know it all anymore. Back in the day,
there's even Australian poetry, if you like.
So I hear, yes. But
which I do.
In the old days of Dead White Men, you could pretty much get your handle on the canon quite easily.
True.
By reading the Victorians.
One of the things I tried to do in this book, but again, I was constricted by the Dead Poets Society rule, and also by the period, partly related to that. There are plenty of women poets I would have put in here if they weren't still alive, and also more poets of color. So I have a couple of those. I've got 6 women, 2 poets of color, and I believe 3 or 4 Hispanics. plus Homer. And Homer is kind of, I guess I count that as a woman poet too, because the translator is so damn good, so much better than anyone else that's done it within
Emily
living
Wilson
memory.
is-
Emily Wilson, she's an absolute master, and her introductions and afterwards are great too. So I felt that she was.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say your choice is diverse and eclectic, but it strikes me as an interesting factor that what you do and what I do in my book is close reading. It's what we grew up reading.
Right.
Close
Right.
critical scrutiny, granular reading, line by line, word by word. How is this effect achieved? What's going on here technically? Can we take it apart and put it together again? Can we parse the poem? Now, the last time that was a commonplace thing was probably back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s.
I
And
agree.
the problem is many of the good influential books of criticism published then did not include many women poets or any poets of colour. And this
They
is
did not.
unfortunate because it served to discredit the technique of criticism and reading rather than, because it wasn't applied to the sort of community of poets that we now happily enjoy. We've thrown away that apparatus because it was applied to a really small elite community. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's something that happened. I think we can correct the diversity problem just by opening up and acknowledging that there were, just as there were women composers, and all of the best classical stations now are reinvestigating and revisiting their work. And guess what? Often they're very great. I'm fascinated when I listen to a classical station, how many women composers of the last century I didn't know anything about, and they're good.
Yeah. It's like we've
So-
discovered the telescope and suddenly there are more stars.
Right, right. And
They
the
were
same thing
always
can
there.
apply.
We now have the means of accessing them. Yeah.
The same thing can apply to poetry. And I mentioned some of the people whose close critical reading mattered to me. One of them was a guy named Paul Carroll, who happened to be a Chicagoan like myself. And he had a book called
He wrote the poem In Its Skin, didn't he?
The Poem in Its Skin, which is 10 really deep essays of the kind you and I love. And only one of them is about a woman poet, and none of them are about poets of color. And I think, you know, one of the things I was inspired by his book, it meant a lot to me when I was younger, still does, but I wanted to correct that. So two of the poets that he could have put in there, poets of color, which are Etheridge Knight and Lucille Clifton, I made a point of putting in this book. And I also put in as many women as I can. Oh, there's only 6 compared to the 14 men, because again, their work is not as well known as it should be. I'll try to get more in next time. But there are, I mean, considering how little they're known, the book does include the work of 2 Nobel Prize winners, right? Gabriela Mistral, the Hispanic poet, one of the first,
Louise Gluck, of course.
and Louise, Gluck. I think I pronounce it Gluck. I think in German it would be Gluck, but at least it's not Glock. Yeah,
So,
I admire her too.
So you're heavily influenced by the kind of critics who are writing the books that we read, and you've written the kind of book here that you want to read, if you see what I mean. You say that's
Exactly.
a simple selfish reason. Yeah.
And I felt that you did the same. I feel A Crumpled Swan is exactly that kind of book. And it is about one poem, which is great enough to deserve that close treatment. But it's also like it's like turning Montaigne or David Hume or somebody else loose on something. And it's things they thought about on the way to other things, which of course is what art does. It makes you, it inspires you. It might inspire you to create. It certainly inspires you to think and connect. And I think that's what's wonderful about it.
You make this point. You want to share, and you're very good at sharing your enthusiasm and reaction and personal feelings. It's what academic writing never really does, and what I find rebarbative about almost all academic writing about everything, but especially literary criticism. There's nothing there for me. There's an agenda that I don't particularly have an interest in or a stake in. They seem to have lost sight in many cases of the pleasure of reading and what a writer's doing and what they're for. And there's so little good criticism now that one can enjoy as a reader, as opposed to bad criticism by academics, or should we say, criticism that pursues a critical agenda that's not actually aligned with what readers do.
Right. It's something that's not ideological, or, you know, all the ways that criticism can go wrong. And poetry is so personal. I mean, even if the I in the poem is not the I of the author, it's very personal, and that's how you take it and you respond to it. It touches you. You were so moved by a poem that it made you write 50 essays. I think that's fantastic. I wish
I could have done
every
100.
poet could have that.
Well, as I hope I make clear in the course of the book, that not every poem prompts and repays that degree of attention, and not every one of the 50 essays is exclusively about this one poem, although
They sure aren't. They're about a whole bunch of other cool stuff that you thought of as a result of thinking about the poem.
But that's what a good poem does. It prompts other
Yes.
thoughts in other directions that wouldn't
Yes.
otherwise occur to you, and opens up new portal experience and understanding. And I could, this is no exaggeration, write another 50 essays prompted by Abigail Parry's poem.
I'll bet you could.
I shan't. I'm not, it's not a threat. But having read your book, I love the idea of a series of freestanding essays about individual poems. I think that's what I want. That's what I need. I like exegesis and a shared enthusiasm and insight. And you do something I could never do. You write interestingly about free verse. And although I admire a lot of free verse writing, there's not a lot to be said about free verse from the perspective that involves a lot of apparatus. I can't bring much to the table of free verse, because at its worst it's just chopped up prose. At its best, it's just chopped up prose as well.
Okay, well, I
expect prose at its best, and I yield to none in my admiration for free verse poets of the 20th century. But it's hard to write about. You do it very well, but I never know what to say about free verse poetry.
You can still. I mean, they may not have rhyme, although sometimes they cheat. Sometimes they put rhyme in there, but they do it subtly, and they usually do it within the line. For example, in the Mary Oliver essay, there are rhymes in her poem, but they're mostly internal. And in a way, you could say that H.D.'s poem that I read about, Evening, it has rhymes in the repetition of words, and you have one of your essays is about that. That is a form of rhyming. It's just not an end line.
I agree. I mean, there's big glib, of course. There's a lot going on in the playlist of free verse, and a lot to enjoy. In fact, maybe that's a good cue for the first example from your book, which you suggested we look at, which is by Robinson Jeffers. Can we cut to that? It's a fruitful inquiry.
So I picked his poem, which is a 10-line poem, and it's a very early poem by him, so it's in the public domain, thankfully. It's called To the Stonecutters, and it's very well known. It's often anthologized. And here it is, To the Stonecutters. Stonecutters, fighting time with marble, you four defeated challengers of oblivion, eat cynical earnings, knowing rock splits, records fall down, the square-limbed Roman letters scale in the thaws, wear in the rain. The poet as well builds his monument mockingly. For man will be blotted out, the blithe earth die, the brave sun die blind and blackened to the heart. Yet stones have stood for 1,000 years, and pained thoughts found the honey of peace in old poems. I love that. It's shorter. It's 4 lines shorter than a sonnet, and I think it's just as good. There's a lot going on in it, especially with alliteration and assonance and some repeated rhetorical patterns. I do a lot of analyzing of that, and you could do that too with free verse. Every free verse poem is basically creating its own form, and that works when the poet understands that that's what they're doing, that they're not just chopping up prose, but they're not making it according to a pre-existing pattern. They're making it according to a new pattern that their subject and their impulse dictates.
But also, and forensically, here's a poet who does know a bit about form. And
he does.
I'm looking at this code. There's a brilliant kind of Yeatsian 14er there. The poet as well builds his monument mockingly. Is there hiding in plain sight, so to speak, a beautifully rhythmic line, but it's broken and shared over 2 lines.
Yes.
I can't say I find Jeffers an especially sympathetic person. What is it, inhumanism?
Oh, he's
like the Ayn
inhumanism.
Rand. He's the Ayn Rand of poetry, isn't he?
Well, he didn't go
He doesn't
that
like
direction,
reality.
but there is a Robert Bly says about him somewhere that you get the sense reading his stuff that he'd be perfectly okay if humanity was wiped out and all that was left was some sea lions and some hawks on the California coast, and he'd be okay with that.
And he'd sit in that room. He built a bloody ugly house, didn't he, out of boulders?
I've seen it. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, it's horrible.
It's horrible, but he liked it. That's the important thing, and apparently his wife liked it.
What's it called? It's called something like Hawk Tower, I think. It's built of boulders, and it's a solid block house, and it looks
Tor
so
House. Tor House. You
Tor
can
House,
see it.
Tor House. I've seen photographs of it, and it's big. He loved the boulders up from the beach and built this thing. It looks like Fred Flintstone lives there.
It almost is like that, but I respect any man that builds his own house, and especially that makes it out of stones. That's not an easy thing to do.
He was also quite well off, wasn't he?
I don't know about his fun.
I don't know about his father died and left him $2,000 a year, which was a very large inheritance.
He wrote a lot. That probably his inheritance probably came in handy when the literary world turned on him, because he wasn't gung-ho for World War II, which I talk about in the essay about him.
Very interesting in your essay. I didn't realize this about him, that he was opposed to World War II for all the obvious reasons, at a time when it actually turned out to be he was on the wrong side historically. Not politically.
He was on the wrong side, of history, but he wasn't Pound. He wasn't a fascist. He was the opposite of that. He was my tribute poem may go into that a little bit. In my tribute poem, I'm trying to reinterpret him and his poem in a way that understands something of the soft, cream-filled center underneath his inhumanism.
The honey of peace in the old poems. I think it's a very impressive, solid, rather stern, severe poem. It's not warm, is it? The square limbed Roman letters and the erosion of time, and stating something, I guess, which is almost a cliche, that we're not going to be here for long, and nothing will outlive us.
It is a cliche, but somehow in his hands, it's really not. I think he feels it deeply. He was very much influenced by all the classics, the Greeks and Romans. If you want, I can read the tribute
you do a
poem.
marvelous job sorry, I'm talking over. You do a marvelous job of analyzing at a granular level how he achieves these effects using particular sounds, alliterations, assonance, dissonance, and so on, which is wonderful. It's what I most want in poetry criticism. How's it done? How is it achieved? Does it come off?
He gets it done. He didn't. I don't know if he thought his short poems were his legacy. He had all these long epics, which almost no one reads anymore. They've all been collected now. I think it's the University of California Press that has a 5-volume series of his work, and it's worth having. But honestly, those epics are like mini poetic epics. It's passages of real poetry, and then it's pasted to something else, and then it's hard to sustain an epic. Unless you're Homer.
Maybe that explains his relative lack of a reputation on this side of the Atlantic. We don't know what his touchstone poems might be, or his signature poems, or has he got a road less taken, if you see what I mean?
This is one of them, and there's other ones. He has there's several selections of his work. The best one, I think, is by the poet and translator Robert Haas, who put it together. It's a collection of his short poems, and that, I think, to me, is the essence of him. And I mentioned that in the essay.
Well, if we can now cut to the essence of you, which is your response to Jeffers and your poem, which comes at the end of your essay, which analyzes the poem, and yours is called To the Stonecutters.
Yes, I was being very literally ekphrastic when I did this one. It was only my second one. To the Stonecutters. Stones have stood for 1,000 years, you said, and this little one of yours, cut from the hard marble of our beloved Anglo-Saxon, has already made it into its 2nd century. I think it will live as long as there are humans left on Earth who remember what it is to be human, a future you did not consider very likely, though if it should come to pass, your tough and tender poems will have played their part. How often you spoke of our end, sometimes almost with relish, other times with regret. You foresaw an age when the hawks and sea lions would own the rocky California coast without the eye of man or woman to recognize their majesty and celebrate it in words musical and true. I hope you're wrong. And in your huge, hurt heart, the heart of many a misunderstood misanthropist, I believe you hoped so too. The poet as well builds his monument mockingly, you said, but all you ever mocked was the imbecility of politics and the madness of war, two sides of the same counterfeit coin. For the stonecutters, your brothers and sisters in the twin arts of nobility and futility, you felt nothing but love, the same love that welled up in you like ocean waves for the whole wide, woebegone world.
You end with a marvelous piece of alliteration there. The whole wide, woebegone world is lovely. Excellent. I quibble over his line that stones have stood for 1,000 years. If he's talking about architectural stones, well, more than 1,000 years, surely 2,000, 3,000.
Well, yeah. I think actually he's talking about grave monuments, which don't tend to last that long.
You make this point that stonecutters could be engravers. They could be cutting and engraving headstones. And as you rightly put, not every town has a sculpture, but every town has a graveyard or a cemetery. And it hadn't occurred to me because I think of stonecutters as being people chipping away at flint to make building blocks. Or
I like the fact that he made them the makers of gravestones because they're artists in a way, and there may be a lot of interesting filigree work on a gravestone, but essentially it's a craft. So it's kind of, in a way, it's a humble way of looking at what he does. I like that about him.
I think so. Reading your poem sends you back to the original by Jeffers with a new appreciation, and you do this so well again and again and again. You take a poem, in many cases one that's completely unfamiliar to me, and analyze it beautifully, forensically, closely. You dust it for prints, you might say, and then do the unique thing. And I commend this practice. You come up with your own poem. Which is enriched by the original, but serves to enrich the original in return. And that kind of ekphrastic is the word you use. That exchange, that dialogue is thrilling. I think.
Well, I appreciate that. All I can say is I had a lot of fun doing it, and I really appreciate that our mutual publisher, Mr. Smulyan, let me do it, and hopefully will keep letting me do it.
It was Ezra Pound. Reportedly Ezra Pound, who said that when two people agree, one of them is unnecessary.
I saw that in the book. That's one of many. There's so many things I liked about this book. Okay, a few points I disagreed with.
I've touched on this before, but in your essay on Annus Mirabilis by Philip Larkin, that very well-known poem, Sexual Intercourse began in 1963. It begins. You mentioned Eliot saying that Yeats was the best poet to write English in the previous 200 years. And developing that line of reason, you throw some very interesting names in the hat, or hats in the ring. I'm not sure I've figured that out right. Who are the best American poets since Yeats? And let's not include Eliot in any conversation here. And you say James Wright, possibly W.S. Merwin, both of whom I know but not well, and Louise Gluck, the Nobel Prize laureate.
Gluck, yeah,
who I've managed to avoid so far, and on the strength of what I have read, I'll continue to do so, I think. And in the UK, you say it's either Ted Hughes or Philip Larkin, and we've already touched on Auden as being someone who could go a few rounds with both of them at the same time.
Oh, totally agree. I should have mentioned Auden. I really should have.
I think Auden's a man of letters, to use a very dusty phrase, as a critic, essayist, dramatist. He covers all the bases.
They could have given him a Nobel for any number of reasons, not just the poetry, although the poetry is what's outstanding, but really everything he did has so much heart and soul and intelligence in it. I have read all of his stuff, every single thing. The Commonplace book, everything.
Yeah, it's he's durable, and I'm reading him, so to speak. I'm reading him at my age when he was my age. He's a poet for life. In my 30s, I was the 30-year-old Auden. In my 40s, the 40-year-old Auden. I'm now on the 60-year-old Auden. and keeping pace, trying to keep up. And I hope I outlive him because I'd like to go back and start all over again. But I've got a Gordon on the shelves behind me, the complete works by edited by Edward Mendelsohn are magnificent. No one deserves that.
You pointed out a few other mistakes I made.
A questionable judgment.
Yes. I left them in the book because they were my actual opinion, and I thought I could at least defend my opinion. But we disagreed on Robert Lowell.
Well, Robert Lowell is interesting. I think Auden, he's almost like Citizen Kane. He shouldn't be in any list because it's unfair to the others.
Right.
Or the series, should we say? But and also because, like Alfred Hitchcock, he had equally successful careers in Britain and America. There's British Hitchcock that the Americans tend not to know much about, and there's the American Hitchcock that we all know about. That's another story for another time. But in the case of Robert Lowell, who enjoys a pretty big reputation over here, and doesn't strike you as being one of the major American poets of the 20th century.
I didn't withdraw it from the book, but I want to qualify my statements this way. A more fair way to put it would be hugely talented, and partly my disappointment in him is that all of that talent, in my view, almost all of it, was expended on adopting and then discarding styles that weren't true to whoever he was as a poet. And he began with trying to out Eliot, and he ended up doing other things later in a more confessional vein. To tell you the truth, the thing that I like best about him, and maybe this isn't fair, but when he did translations, he called them versions because he took so many liberties with them. But I think that for some reason, translating someone else's work, and he was brilliant at that, liberated the real poet. At least that's the way I view it. And I can see why people would disagree with that. And
I think that's a good point, well made. I'd agree with you. I think he has a lot to. We can blame him for confessional poetry, and I think that's where he kind of went off the rails.
Well, not entirely. I like confessional poetry. I just felt, and maybe it's, again, I could be wrong, but my sense was whatever it was, that wasn't him. He was like jumping from one thing to another, which poets do and can do, but none of them seemed to be the real him that I could tell. Anyway, and
it's also it's a matter of advocacy. He was championed over here by the great Ian Hamilton, who was a poet himself and an editor of Genius and a man of letters. And Hamilton wrote a very fine biography of Robert Lowell, which was also.
I haven't read that.
Part of his reputation in Britain is down to Hamilton as a champion, as an advocate.
Well, I would like Hamilton for a champion for sure.
Oh yes, I mean, and you trust the man when it comes to judgment on poetry, and he had critical things to say about Lowell, but also, of course, Lowell was a huge fish in a small pond. When he came to live over here, we had our own American poet resident in London, and visible, culturally very visible here, and perhaps not in America.
And it's interesting when artists do that. I'm thinking of you mentioned Hitchcock, who I love and adore. I think he's the greatest director of all time because he's the most closely in touch with the unconscious, and the part that music moves, the part that poetry moves. It can move your intelligence. In Hitchcock, the dialogue is always witty and intelligent. The plot is interesting, sometimes intricate, but what he's doing is playing with your subconscious, and poetry does the same thing. Anyway, I was going to say his best musical collaborator, Bernard Herrmann, after he broke with Hitchcock tragically, he spent his last 5 years in England. And so you had, in my opinion, arguably, certainly one of the greatest composers in the world living there.
I don't think it's the same Bernard Herrmann.
No, it is. It is.
I may have to go and double check this. Believe me, there was another British composer called Bernard Herrmann.
Might be, no, but this was the one
who wrote stuff for television. And I remember coming across this and thinking, good God, really? So I hope you're right. I'll double check.
Bernard Herrmann wrote for Twilight Zone, for the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. He wrote what they call.
American. That's American.
When he moved there, he wrote Twisted Nerve, which was a Haley Mills movie trying to turn her into an adult actress?
Absolutely. No, I'd love to know. If you say so, I'm not going to doubt you for a second.
Trust me, I'm going to. Someone just released a book about Hitchcock's work with Herman, and he's the world's leading expert. And I'm going to review it for Exacting Clam, and it'll all be in there. But anyway.
This will be cut out of the final recording. But
if
you go online onto YouTube, you can find a brilliant.
Leave it in, Jacob.
There's a brilliant dazzling print of The Trouble with Harry. Now, I published a long essay on The Trouble with Harry last year, and which I think is the most underrated of all Hitchcock films, and Hitchcock's personal favourite, because it's a light romantic comedy about necrophilia. Right. It's about a disintegrating corpse. It's the most revolting film. Really, the minute you start looking closely at it, or even not even closely at it, it's the most transgressive, dark, and weird. I call it pastoral noir. And it's the first Bernard Herrmann score. It was the first...
It is, and what I love about that score, when you hear that music, it sounds like a beautiful golden New England symphony. It's just so damn beautiful, and it captures the funny and romantic nature of this necrophiliac film that only Hitchcock could have done. Herman got him exactly. He understood exactly what was needed.
Utterly, what a career! What a great composer. I think there's an equivalent to Hitchcock today, and an equivalent to Bernard Herrmann, and that's Paul Thomas Anderson and Johnny Greenwood, who does the musical scores for his movies. Anderson,
Radiohead, yeah, and he does. Johnny Greenwood does it, and Tom York did it for, I think, Suspiria.
Greenwood's score for Phantom Thread is just one of the very best film scores I've ever heard, and his current score for
I totally agree.
Amazing.
Look at all these. The Atlantic is shrinking to a tiny little trickle, and nothing stands between us because we agree on these moments of greatness in music and film.
Well, the best films, the best. I quote a chap called Geoffrey Grigson, a forgotten critic of the 50s, but a hero of mine, who says that poetry means good poetry. Because if it's not good poetry, it's not poetry. So to say good poetry is a tautology, because if it's good poetry, it's poetry, and if it's not good poetry, it's not poetry at all. Which is most of everything, most football, most music, most painting, most jogging is rubbish. And it's the good stuff that matters. And in the case of cinema, the rewards of Paul Thomas Anderson are the same as the rewards of poetry.
Very provocative, a very provocative filmmaker.
Yeah, and you don't get it first time, or even the second time. So the third or fourth or seventh viewing, that that was there all the time, and I never realised it's waiting to be discovered. Wonderful. But we shouldn't get onto film. That can be our next podcast.
We could talk about that all day. Yeah,
we could. I'd love to. I find it easier to talk about films which are a kind of collective experience than poetry, which is essentially, I insist, a solitary experience. It's produced in isolation by a person working alone, and it should be consumed alone, one-to-one. I'm not a great fan of readings and public gatherings. And
they're often disappointing in a way, but when you've got a great reader, I'm thinking of some of the great readings I've been to. I was lucky enough to see W.S. Merwin read, and I'm so glad I saw that. I was lucky enough to see Borges read, and that's in the essay I've written about him.
About Oblivion, very good there.
And when Borges reads, he's not reading, he's reciting from memory. Because he's blind.
I think all poets should do that. I don't like to see a poet fumbling around with papers and books. If they can't do it from memory, why should we bother? If it's not worth memorizing. You don't see an actor walking around with a script, do you?
It's hard to argue with that.
I'm the best poets I know over here. J.O. Morgan, Alice Oswald, they recite from memory because they can, and because it's worth the effort, and we pay attention more. But I feel disadvantaged if I can't see the poem in front of me, because I don't know how long it's going to be. I don't know how to organize my response unless I can see the words.
Right.
I'm a better reader than I am listener, and most readers of poetry aren't very good at it. Some are very good, but most are not. Whether actors or poets, they don't know how to read poetry. They give it poet voice. That
yeah.
It's not in a typhoon voice.
Sing song, sepulchral. Yeah, it's
far away. And I hate that.
Don't even start.
I hate that. I prefer the voice in my head, which is I've got different voices I can use for. Cary Grant, for example, or Katharine Hepburn. You know.
I would listen to Cary Grant read poetry all day. Or, as you mentioned, I could listen to David Niven recite Andrew Marvell in the Powell and Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death. Do you know one of my unfinished projects?
I'd rather have written that than flown through Hitler's legs. Andy Marvel, what a marvel.
One of my unfinished projects is I'm acquainted with Martin Scorsese's editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, and Oscar-winning editor multiple times. And she happens to be Michael Powell's widow and the executor of his estate. And one of the things I wanted to do was put together a comprehensive Powell and Pressburger collection of screenplays. It'd probably be multiple volumes. That has never transpired because the materials are in the hands of the British Film Institute, rotting in a shed, and she's been trying to deal with that for years. If that can ever happen, I would love to edit that book for her.
They are ill-served by the BFI. I saw Michael Powell a few times presenting his films when his reputation was at a nadir before Scorsese got involved with the restoration, and I think the first thing he brought back was Gone to Earth, was the first Scorsese restoration, and suddenly we started seeing Powell and Pressburger films on screens for the first time in a generation. And it was a revelation. I found this out only last week. At the start of every Archer's film, there's a target. And
yes.
It's a different one every time.
Yes.
It's not the same ident for every film. They filmed it again for every film. I didn't know that.
The most creative screenwriters of all time, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything like their work. It's unique. And it's no wonder that all the great people, Scorsese, Spielberg, George Lucas, they all love Powell and Pressburger, and
it's one of the Ivor Truffaut who said the idea of British cinema was ridiculous. There's no such thing as British cinema. Well, actually, I think Powell and Pressburger can shit all over the new wave when it comes to the full exploitation of a medium and using all the resources of studio, location, film, color, lighting, script, everything.
But isn't it interesting how they Powell started, well, they both started in silent film like Hitchcock. So they learned how to tell a story in images only. And I think that's what made them so great, because when dialogue came, it just added to what they could already do. So let's turn away from these wonderful things and talk about a few things I noted in your book. I just want to make sure I get through my notes. Some things that struck me, these will just be kind of random.
Yeah, sure.
The place where you point out the difference between our striving for happiness and the fact that what we really need is meaning. And of course, specifically related to your book, it's the meaning we get out of art more than anything. Happiness is an illusion. Meaning is real. Meaning can be...
yeah, I think so.
It can be grasped.
It's not a specifically original thought. I think a lot of philosophers have said that meaning overrides happiness as a reason to live. And the pursuit of happiness, I don't know if I quoted in the book, but there's a story of a woman who visits Dr. Freud when he moved to London, just practiced briefly in Hampstead, and a London matron visited him, and he listened to her describe her prevails and said, "Madam, with a course of analysis, you can be happy." And she said, "No, Dr. Freud, I don't want to be happy. I just want to be miserable like ordinary people." And this was an illumination for Freud, because he thought that actually dealing with unhappiness is a kind of good mental health. Being happy all the time is neither desirable nor possible. But to be
nor a sign of health.
Manage is a natural condition. That's what matters. Managing your unhappiness. And you manage unhappiness if your life has meaning and purpose and is productive and satisfying in some way. And art, of course, is a great, not a palliation, but it's an alternative, we say, to unhappiness and misery and a lack of fulfillment. And if you want to see what life without art is like, look at Trump. A man without culture. He
thinks he knows about art.
No, there's no soul there to engage with anything.
He knows what he likes.
Yeah, and it's not art, is it? I think art, whatever form it takes, is a way of getting out of yourself and seeing the world through someone else's eyes, and how it was for them there then, and how it can be for us here now. It doesn't have to make you feel good. It just has to make you feel more.
Right.
And as I think I read poetry not because it makes me better than other people, but it makes me a lot better than the person I would otherwise be, without the consolations and instruction that poetry above all, but also other arts give us. But the trick is to navigate all the rubbish, and there's so much rubbish, and to find the things that matter. And we need guides for this. I need to be told, informed, instructed. We used to have
which makes your book valuable, not only as a guide to Abigail Parry's poem, but to so many other things. Okay, so here's a list of things that are connections between your mental life and mine that interested me and surprised me. You talk about Laurel and Hardy and the short county hospital where Oliver is with increasing frustration watching Stan peel a hard-boiled egg. It's one of my favorite ones. Of course, later on in that same short, I think it's Stanley is driving because he has to, because Oliver has the hurt leg, but Stanley has received an accidental dose of a sedative, and so he's driving like a madman, half asleep through traffic, and it ends up crushing their car but leaving them alive. You talk about the great William McGonagall, over whom the great Spike Milligan made a lot of fun. I agree with you that Spike Milligan's film about him is not very funny, but the 4 books he did responding to McGonagall are actually very good and very Goon-like and worth reading. I think
McGonagall is misunderstood. He's not a bad poet. He's a good bad poet.
He's memorably bad and amusingly bad.
And fondly regarded, because we can all see what a bad poet it is, and we approve somehow. And I think, I forget who was it Ben Pester? Someone has criticized him for all the wrong reasons, but because they don't get it. That McGonagall is the exemplary bad poet. It's very hard to do what he does. He was never in any doubt about his genius.
Apparently it's not hard for him, but what I like about
it's hard to write bad poetry as badly as he does so well.
He's a natural talent. But here's the thing: you think about McGonagall and you think, is your life better because you know about him? And of course it is. Of course it is. So I don't know what that is.
We enjoy the sense of condescension we feel towards him. We enjoy the fact that we know he's such a bad poet. It makes us feel good about ourselves.
It's even a little more than that. There's genuine affection for him. He's like a crazy uncle in a way. I like too talking about all the bad poetry that came out of this and reminding us what a towering figure of genius Thomas Hardy was, not just as a novelist, but as a poet. And I don't think the average person even knows that he wrote poetry, even though it was the thing he wanted to do more than write novels.
2 of our best poets are D.H. Lawrence and Thomas Hardy, but their poetry doesn't get a look in or barely. And I don't much like the novels of Hardy. I don't particularly like most of the novels of D.H. Lawrence. It's their poetry, for me, they're great.
I think they're both genius poets, and I think I love the fact that Hardy got rich from writing novels and spent the last 3 decades of his life writing poetry, and it's great. It's stuff like The Convergence of the Twain about the sinking of the Titanic. I just love him. I'll probably do a Hardy poem in the next series of tributaries.
Well, there are plenty to choose from. It's odd that Auden said he could never write a novel because he just admired people who were able to write novels, but he could only write poetry. And there are a few poets who've written novels. C.D. Lewis comes to mind as a bad example. J.O. Morgan as a good example. A Scottish poet, and very famous. But it's odd that Hardy's poetry is virtually unknown now.
It's monumentally good. I mean, he wrote a huge amount of it, and it's all good. So I'll have trouble picking one.
A huge influence on Philip Larkin. Larkin saw Hardy as his absolute forebear and mentor.
Oh, I agree. You can see the connection. I don't have any organic connection to him except that I love his work. And it's very, how can I say, for a guy that was so deep into the 19th century, it has a very modern sensibility, I find.
Yes.
I mean, it's still, I guess it's still relevant because that's what a masterpiece is.
Well, I include Hardy's poem about the Titanic in my book, and people are surprised. Thomas Hardy? Titanic? They don't think they kind of overlap chronologically that Hardy was alive when the Titanic sank. They think of him as being fixed in the 19th century in Wessex and rural. But no, he was from the modern world, very much so.
He was. One name I was very surprised to find, John Cooper Clarke. You mentioned him, and there's a connection there because he not too long ago made an album of covers with Hugh Cornwell of the Stranglers, and Hugh Cornwell and the Stranglers are some of my favorite modern music. Hugh Cornwell also has tried to write 3 of them. I haven't heard them because I'm afraid they're going to be bad.
What I love about John Cooper Clarke, as a student in Manchester in the late 1970s, I used to see him sometimes twice a day performing in pubs and bars and clubs and supporting bands like Buzzcocks and The Fall.
Right.
But I say this with absolute admiration. He hasn't moved an inch forward.
No.
Poetically, he's still doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. He's never developed. He's
a wonderful character
throughout, and he's doing exactly the same stand-up poems now that he was doing 40 years ago.
So all these points of continuity. Okay, here's the name. I was not expecting to find this name or the title of this book. Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. One of the most important books in shaping my worldview.
Oh, really?
And Jacob, our publisher, will remember this. When we were at the home of a poet who was hosting a reading for Exacting Clam, and he was a philosopher, and he had that book on his wall, and I was so impressed. I spent a lot of time talking to him about his philosophical studies.
I'm trying to remember where in my book I mentioned him. It's probably some show-off footnote, isn't it?
It's in a footnote. But as I say, it's very strange to me. We have more in common than you think. You know, you were tortured as a child mentally by the Jehovah's Witnesses. I was tortured as a child by my parents and by some of the people they let into our home. We both sought solace in art and specifically in poetry, and we both grappled with those early woundings, I guess, and look what we're doing now.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your childhood travails, and you've arrived in a good place, I hope, in spite of or because of exactly that. Yes, literature is a consolation. Poetry is a consolation. It's getting outside yourself and helping you to create a true persona, I suppose, which is a kind of anthology of other personas. Sorry, we're getting to that moment in movies where A says to or we're the same, you and I, says the villain to the hero. We've quite possibly separated at birth. I think we probably went through pretty much the same formative influences. And this is, I think, one of the problems with transatlantic poetry is that social circumstances and conditions here are not the same as they were in the United States in the 60s and 70s, when you had so much going on in terms of counterculture in particular, and black rights and civil rights and Martin Luther King. We didn't have any of that, really. We didn't have, well, we had other things going on, but it's a little harder for us to get a purchase on the drivers to American poetry from the Beat era onwards, if you see what I mean.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
a bit like French rock and roll. You know how French rock and roll is famously rubbish?
I like some of the progressive bands, he said timorously.
No, you know what I mean, Johnny Hallyday.
I do know. Yeah,
that sort of. It doesn't ring true. It's not authentic. British rock and roll. Well, it's pretty good. But the real deal is American, isn't it?
Americans tend to see it in reverse because everything came from the Beatles and all of the other beat bands, and then Americans. All we had. I mean, I skip over Elvis.
All you had was Little Richard.
Well, we had Little Richard. Yes, we had that. We had Johnny Cash, and we had a few other people. But it was mostly pablum, and the Beatles changed that. And in response to the Beatles, you got Bob Dylan, and you got the Byrds, and then you had this whole opening up of the San Francisco scene and everything.
I thought there was a lot of hostility to the British invasion with Herman's Hermits and all these shallow.
I don't think so. I think it was American. Huh? I think it was more hero worship. I do. Oh yeah.
Of course. The bands over here admire black music far more. Soul.
Well, and the Americans did too, depending on what kind of music they were playing. But I recently saw Roger McGuinn, the leader of the Byrds, play a solo show, and he talked about how when A Hard Day's Night came out, the Byrds, or there was three of them at that time. It was him, David Crosby, and Gene Clark, I believe. And the first thing maybe the whole band was together, and they went to the movie and they took notes on all of the equipment. Gretsch, Rickenbacker, everything the Beatles played, they had to have. And then they took that 12-string guitar and they took a Dylan song and cut it to fit radio and made a hit. And then they were off and running. And then they were influencing the sound of the Beatles on albums like Rubber Soul. So it was a mutual thing. But the British invasion, from our point of view, I think, is very much the thing that got it going. And those bands that evolved did so. And here they did too, but not as much as the Beatles. That's why my next book is called A Little Book About the Beatles.
Oh, I'm in. You've never run out of things to say about the Beatles.
I agree.
I was watching this week a very good film made 20 years ago called 24-Hour Party People, about the Manchester music scene when I lived there as a student in the 70s and 80s, and about a man called Tony Wilson. And the best bit of it, for my money, is a recreation of this seminal event in Manchester in 1976 when the Sex Pistols played in Manchester. They were banned everywhere. They played in a small Manchester club, and there was an audience of about 40. Okay, although thousands claim to have been there. There were about 40 people there, and it's recreated. And the narrator points out the people in the room. See those 4 guys at the back? They will be Joy Division. This guy over here is Nick Hutchell. These are the Buzzcocks. And everyone in the room went on to either form a band or to become some sort of cultural mover and shaker in the decade that followed. Everyone. No one there left its mark.
Very similar to the release of the first Velvet Underground album, where the Velvet Underground and Nico in '67, somebody said initially it only sold 1,000 copies, but everybody that bought one started a band. And so then
a variant when Brian Eno released his ambient album, songs for airports. Everyone who bought it went out and started their own airport.
Yes. Or their own airport music. And isn't it interesting, that album is supposed to be background music, but it's too good to be background music. You can't listen to it that way.
It's foreground music. It's very distracting. You can't do anything while it's on.
Sorry, Brian, you failed in your purpose, but you made a good album. Okay, so I'm guessing that we probably run around the course here.
We've left Jacob with an editing job because we did go on a bit about cinema and Powell and Pressburger and rock and roll and everything except our book. Can I start off by just I'm not going to blurb my book, I'm going to blurb yours. This is wonderful. It's the sort of book I wish you'd write, or other people would write as well, because it's the sort of book I most like to read. Short essays about poems and short essays about anything, because that's about my distance, mentally, intellectually. I can't be doing with long form studies. I like short, punchy, 1,500 words, 2,000 words. That's about right for me. And this is an exemplary approach and an original one. I don't know of anyone else who's ever done this particular thing of responding to a poem with a poem as part of the exegesis. It makes me want to try myself, although I'm rubbish at poetry, so I won't do that.
Well, how do we know until we try?
I know I've tried. I can't. It's like tap dancing or juggling. You know soon on that you'll never get there.
Let me blurb this. A Crumpled Swan, also, I believe, a unique book, and nominally 50 very fine essays in response to the very fine Abigail Parry poem in The Dream of the Cold Restaurant, but in fact, about everything that life and art and poetry could be, and that are inspired by thinking about one poem. There is, I would say it's one of the best books of its kind, except there is no other book like it. And I think that's one thing our books have in common. I don't know of anyone else that has done just this thing.
Well, we're writing the books we want to read, and we're doing it for ourselves.
Exactly.
But I think we're also doing it for each other, Kurt. We're doing it for each other.
And I'm doing it for Jacob, who, God bless him, still publishes us. I think that's wonderful.
Where would we be without him?
Scabbers, if you're listening, this is for you.
He's the Godot to our Vladimir and Estragon, isn't he, really?
When you think about it, yes.